Bom, boa tarde a todas e todos. Bem-vindos à penúltima sessão, a 11ª sessão do 10º Simpósio Lendo, Vendo e Ouvindo Passado. E nessa sessão nós teremos duas palestras da professora Ana Vicentini e do professor Martin Winkler, e elas serão moderadas pelo professor Edson Silva, a quem eu agradeço. O professor Edson é professor de latim da Universidade Federal de Viçosa e tem participado ativamente em vários projetos em conjunto, né, na área de estudos clássicos, recepção da cultura clássica, principalmente no cinema. Então, agradeço a todos pela presença, especialmente aos palestrantes, agradeço também muito aos monitores, né? E passo, então, ao Edson para fazer a apresentação. Obrigada, Edson.
Oi, Cecília. Bom, boa tarde a todos e todas. Eu estou com um probleminha técnico aqui, queria um auxílio de vocês para solucionar. Eu estou vendo o PowerPoint da professora Ana Vicentini e não vejo vocês na tela. É assim mesmo? Normalmente? Ou eu que estou equivocado e não estou clicando no local correto?
Você pode dar 2 cliques na tela, Edson. Acredito que aí ela deve voltar.
Sim, obrigado, Eduardo. Agora está melhor, que eu estava ouvindo satisfatoriamente, felizmente, a Cecília, mas agora estou vendo algumas imagens. Bom, bem-vindos a essa mesa 11, então, né, do 10º Simpósio Lendo, Vendo e Ouvindo Passado. Eu queria rapidamente agradecer a professora Maria Cecília Coelho, a professora Júlia Avelar, no nome delas, aos demais organizadores do evento, por me convidarem para fazer aqui essa mediação. Peço desculpas por não ter podido participar das demais atividades, mas estava presidindo uma banca de concurso de professor aqui na UFV, que terminou agora à tarde, e estou aqui ansioso para ouvir a fala dos convidados, e passo, então, a apresentar a primeira professora. Estou aqui com minha colinha do smartphone nesse mundo remoto das nossas facilitações. Bom, então, a professora Ana Vicentini de Azevedo, ela possui graduação em Letras pela Universidade de Brasília, mestrado em Literatura e Drama pela University of Essex e o pós-doutorado em Literatura Comparada, estudando tragédia grega e psicanálise pela City University of New York. Ela recebeu o prêmio Margaret Bryant por melhor tese nas suas áreas de estudo no ano acadêmico de 96 e 97, e atualmente ela é professora aposentada da Universidade de Brasília desde 2009, onde trabalhou, né, por longos anos nas áreas de estudo de mitologia e psicanálise, e ainda prestando colaboração docente no Departamento de Letras da Universidade Federal de São Carlos, em São Paulo, de 2006 a 2009. Então, ela atuando nas áreas de psicanálise, teoria da literatura e literatura comparada, vai nos falar nesta mesa o título do seu trabalho, né, The Case of a Trans Subject, em inglês, com um título que já é bastante sugestivo, e eu treinei bastante para falar aqui, que é Ouvindo. O título já é lacaniano por si, mas ela já nos convida a sua fala com o subtítulo Ouvindo with Lacan. Então, com a palavra, a professora Ana Vicentini, a quem nós agradecemos pela presença.
Boa noite a todos, a todas. Muito obrigada, professor Edson, por conseguir pronunciar uma coisa que eu jamais consegui pronunciar. Eu tentei, mas não consegui. Antes de tudo, eu queria agradecer imensamente ao convite tão honroso da professora Cecília, da professora Júlia, com quem eu tenho o privilégio de estar sempre acompanhando as conversas, os debates, os simpósios, colóquios, enfim, e tantos amigos, e já são amigos depois de tantos anos. Nós somos uma wild bunch, como gosta de chamar a professora Cecília, e para mim foi uma honra particularmente especial ter sido convidada para compor uma mesa com o querido amigo e tão apreciado professor Martin Winkler. E, em deferência ao Martin, eu decidi falar em inglês, então me preparei a fala em inglês. Estou fora do Brasil, eu já estou avançada na noite, então meus recursos tecnológicos estão precários, mas acho que está funcionando bem. Eu não me vejo, então apenas ouço, mas qualquer problema, por favor, me avisem. Meu WhatsApp está aberto, Cecília, e então, enfim, qualquer coisa me mandem uma mensagem. O meu tema, depois de ouvir um pouco desta última mesa, eu me desculpo porque eu estou em viagem por questões de família, não ter participado antes, mas o pouco que eu pude ouvir das falas anteriores me impressionaram pela riqueza, pelo rigor, pela profundidade das pesquisas, a amplitude também. O meu caso é o oposto. Eu peguei, meu ponto de partida são 18 linhas do canto sexto, do livro sexto das Metamorfoses. Então, já poderia passar, antes de tudo, para as duas epígrafes que sempre na minha vida funcionaram. Se puderem passar para o segundo slide, as epígrafes sempre funcionaram nos meus textos, no meu pensamento, como criações, como comentários que sustentarão e sustentam o meu pensamento, o meu desenvolvimento. Acho que perante classicistas do porte como vocês, eu vou cometer heresias, mas como uma psicanalista praticante, a heresia é quase uma postura ética do psicanalista, porque é a opção pelo desejo. Então, são duas questões que eu gostaria, especialmente quem vai me ouvir, que não tem muita trajetória nem em psicanálise, ou talvez nem muito em literatura comparada, esses dois. Esse é um pequeno recorte dos Sonhos de uma Noite de Verão, de Shakespeare, que eu acho uma das definições mais lindas do ato poético. And as imagination bodies forth the forms of things unknown, the poet's pen turns them to shapes and gives to airy nothing a local habitation and a name. Eu não vou traduzir Shakespeare. Enfim, quem tiver com o Google aberto pode, mas acho que é uma das mais fecundas definições do ato poético. A outra é algo que concerne a psicanálise de uma forma muito íntima, é quase algo que perturba a psicanálise desde Freud. De onde vem o fazer artístico? Qual é a fonte da criação artística? Lacan esboça uma tentativa de resposta aí, que é a criação a partir do nada, a partir do ex nihilo, e a partir de uma perspectiva não religiosa também, né? Isso eu acho bastante importante. And now I think I'll turn to English and move on because we're short of time. So my discussion of Ovid's Metamorphosis will center on the case of the Satyr Marsyas and his errands in the Western tradition. With a personal note, I would like to begin my talk to you tonight. In 2016, I was in New York City for a very festive occasion. I had been invited to give a lecture to celebrate the 20th anniversary of my PhD. You can realize how old I am. But the important thing is that the dates coincided with an amazing exhibition that was being held at the Met Breuer a distinguished extension of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. The title of the exhibit was more than attractive. Can we have slide 3, please? Thank you. Unfinished, thoughts left visible. The provoking title hit its aim and immediately raised questions to me concerning the open-endedness of a work of art, the limits and possibilities of interpretation, as well as if or when a particular work of art can or should ever be called finished, completed. The subtitle in particular calls to mind the question of enargeia, which, as some of us have already argued, entails the very notion of representation. I think this is a good starting point when we have in mind Ovid's Metamorphosis. But let us remain with the unfinished for a while. At the very opening of the exhibit, right there at the entrance of the 3rd floor, there hang this picture, which is slide number 4, please. Tiziano's The Flaying of Marsyas. Not only the size, high position, and special place in which the painting was displayed, but moreover, the stamp of non finito that went with it were all very overwhelming to me. I could not find any reasonable reproduction of this amazing painting. I mean, you have to see it live. But I must confess that this was not my first encounter with a painting. The very first time, and that was a rather baffling experience for me, was in the obituary of the Irish novelist Iris Murdoch, who died in 1999. The writer's portrait, which had been commissioned by the National Portrait Gallery in London and painted by Tom Phillips, accompanied her obituary in the newspaper, The Independent. That would be slide number 5, Iris Murdoch's portrait. Can we have slide number 5, please? Thank you. I shall leave aside any comments on this particular painting to highlight Murdoch's choice of Tiziano's canvas to accompany her immortalization at the National Gallery. As she declared in various interviews, The Flaying of Marsyas was her favorite painting. We know that she was not the only one in modern or contemporary literature to be attracted to this painting. But I do not repute Murdoch as one of the most important British writers of the 20th century. But her fascination with Tiziano's visual rendering of the 18 verses that comprise Ovid's story has always called my attention and intrigued me in a rather obstinate manner. So I think this is finally a nice opportunity, and a psychoanalytic speaking, very important for me to address some of these questions. Her claim that it is, and I quote her, the greatest painting in the Western canon certainly invites us to unpack such a statement, especially since now I am at this moment speaking from Venice, and I would be very reluctant to choose this particular painting as the most outstanding painting of Western tradition. But anyway, let's move on. In an interview to the critic Geoffrey Myers, sometime after she had actually seen the painting, this painting, the original Tiziano's painting, is in a monastery in Moravia, which is Freud's homeland, now the Czech Republic. Murdoch touches on a very sensitive issue to our discussion. Quote, "The novel often indicates a painting during the process of creating characters. Somehow the character will lead to the painting," unquote. In a sense, we can see a dual carriageway in the relationships she establishes here. It can be read as a restatement of the old long debate, ut pictura poiesis, i.e., poetry is a speaking picture, painting a silent poetry, a conception acknowledged as early as Plutarch as a commonplace. It seems important to leave aside the debate as to which art form is the paradigmatic one, to pursue a more subtle path that Murdoch lays before us. She seems to echo or amplify a subtle verse by Ovid, also in Book 6 of the Metamorphosis. Can we have slide 6, please? I will not dare to read it because my Latin is non-existent. Frank Miller of the Loeb Classical Library Edition translates it as "there is nothing alive in the picture." A more recent Brazilian translation renders it as "nada é vivo na sua figura." And a special translation was given to me last month as "não há nada de vivo na pintura." Despite the differing translation, we can see or read Ovid himself, i.e., the narrator, assuming the majestic character of his poetry, and as a cameraman, freezing the scene of the devastating unfolding of Niobe's story. As the first and last translations bring together and put forth the visual, pictorial, and cinematographic character or dimensions are a key feature of Ovid's poem, highlighted in its critical tradition. We're going to hear Martin shortly talking about that. But what I'd like to stress is that the various episodes, books, and stories that compose Metamorphosis abound in visual details, stimuli, and movement, as Calvino acutely points out. He goes even further. He obviously knows his Aristotle thoroughly and also seems to have attended Cecilia's Symposium on Enargeia. I quote Calvino, "Everything happens before our eyes," unquote. What exactly happens before our eyes? Before going to Ovid's text, let us proceed in a sort of palimpsestic manner to remove some layers, a procedure that makes us shiver in this context, that are closer to us. Freud would call this method, excuse my German, Nachsprachlichkeit, a retroactive action, or a reading in retrospect, as I prefer. We listen, see events, works, analyze words from a standpoint of the effects that a previous fact has had. In other words, it is the effect that produces the cause. An enargaic trait stands out in Iris Murdoch's portrait. Shall we go back to slide number 5, please? At the background, Tom Phillips closes the focus on Apollo holding a scalpel that could clearly be seen as a pen or a brush. On the other side, we have... Yes?
Não, acho que o slide é o 5.
Yes, that's it. That's exactly the one, because that's more, that's the painter, Tom Phillips. He does a close-up, sort of close-up on Tiziano's canvas, on Tiziano's painting. And here on the right-hand side, you have this a smudged dog smiling. And Murdoch's face is placed in the foreground, hyper, very, very bright. And her figure is placed, in an interesting manner. Her pale blue eyes, and I think this is a very important point for me, is looking outside the painting in a distant, stern gaze. This distant gaze, pointing outside the frame, signals to us that there is a somewhere inaccessible, mysterious, that goes beyond the limits of the picture, of representation itself. Another gaze will share the same trait, as we shall see below. The novelist thus becomes fixed, immortalized, having Apollo as both writer and painter behind her, and she and Marsyas merged together, transfigured in an obvious identification she establishes with the satyr. Murdoch views on the artist's position are most salient in this portrait. I should advance that it goes beyond a naive, narcissistic or masochistic redemptive outlook on the artist's craft and his or her position, albeit the religious and sometimes moralistic views she may uphold. Let us recall the synesthetic comments above in the relation to the complex tradition that derives from the ut pictura poiesis, and echo with the principle we can draw from narratology, but which has lately become more than a cliché. Every picture tells a story. Murdoch seems to have Horace's dictum in mind when she remarks that Tiziano's painting, quote, has something to do with human life and all its ambiguities, all its horrors and terrors and misery. And at the same time, there is something beautiful. The picture is beautiful, unquote. Beauty and horror intertwined in such a unique way so that it makes it bearable to us to contemplate or to have a glimpse of our humanity in its divine, bestial, and miserable dimensions at the same time. This is the epitome of great art, I would contend. The temporal aspect is essential in this conflation. In fact, it overlaps by far a binary, clear-cut division of good, evil. Fair is foul and foul is fair at the same time as Macbeth's witches, wise witches, warn us. This ambiguous trait not only makes Murdoch's attraction to the painting more visible in archaic, I'm inventing the word, of course, but also touches on aspects that are central to my argument. In Ovid, as well as in Tiziano's painting, humans are a dingy thing, an expression that I take from Hamlet. That is, the sublime and the horrifying mingle to form our strange Deinos matter. Quote, There is nothing either good or bad. That's Shakespeare again. And I would argue this is Ovid's leitmotif, which is echoed in Shakespeare, Tiziano, Murdoch, and many more. Such an awareness and incorporation of the ambiguities that constitute humans somehow enables Murdoch to identify another important dimension I find in this painting, or rather, let me rephrase it and stress an important dimension in Tiziano's reading of Ovid. Murdoch's comment is, quote, "There is a tragedy taking place in total silence," unquote. So not only do pictures tell a story, but they enact a tragedy, a silent tragedy. Can we go back to slide number 4, please? Two features, it's the previous one, I think. It's Tiziano's painting. No, let's go back. Can you go back to slide number 4? You're moving forward. Peraí. Eduardo, é você que está fazendo?
Yes.
Ok.
Sim, só um minutinho.
Ok.
Agora
obrigada e desculpa não conseguir fazer eu mesma.
É porque é diferente quando eu coloco a tela cheia, me desculpa.
Ah, ok.
Pode continuar.
Tá. So, two features stand out to support Murdoch's statement or reference to tragedy, horror and compassion. That is, the two tragic pathemata that Aristotle points out. The first characteristic is abundant in modern critics of the Venetian painter. Panofsky, for example, qualifies it, and I quote, as excruciating, repellent, and brutal. There is a Tiziano scholar called Filippo Pedrocco who underlines, quote, the cruelty of the Ovidian myth that reaches a level of unspeakable brutality, unquote. Yet, Iris Murdoch forcefully emphasizes the joyful beauty of the painting. She characterizes the scene of Apollo's kneeling before Marsyas as if he were very lovingly removing the skin. These are Murdoch's words. There is horror and beauty and beauty in this pictorial silent tragedy, in this merging of apparently antithetical notions. One could interrogate, is Apollo actually removing, peeling off Marsyas' skin, or is he adding layers of paint onto the satyr? In this respect, one should recall Leonardo da Vinci's distinction. Eduardo, can we go to slide number 7, please? Yes, okay, this is Leonardo da Vinci's comment or distinction. That within the framework of an allegory of the creative process, he says that painting works per via di porre and sculpture per via di levare. So you add and take off. But what we have here in Murdoch's interpretation is somehow an intertwining of via di porre e via di tirare. Thus, horror begins to be transfigured, made bearable through the artist's craft. That's why we can have the combination of pain and beauty in the aesthetic domain, as Jacques Lacan underlines throughout his work. In particular, I would narrow the focus of the aesthetic to that of fantasy, a key concept to the creative activity as well as in mental psychic life. Where can we find the tragic counterpart of phobos, that is, compassion, eleos, to underpin the tragic hues in Tiziano's painting? Murdoch singles it out in relation to Apollo's kindness, while Flamasius, indeed, the Christian-like penitent position of the vengeful god of Apollo and the docility with which he uses his pen brush can make us overlook, even ignore, or intertwine the cruelty of his punishment with the act of creation and with the position of the artist. Both the act and the position occupy a central point of interest for me in the story of Marsyas. Let us have a closer look at his face. That would be slide number 8, Eduardo. It is upside down. That's a close-up of Tiziano's painting of Marsyas' face. The appeased, languid gaze and the overall tranquility of his face brings us close to the repellent, unbearable brutality Tiziano's critics attacked above. Marsyas' face seems detached from the martyrdom that is going on in his body. His gaze, in particular, accounts for this detachment. Pay a close attention to that. Like Murdoch's eyes, his eyes are directed, attracted to somewhere outside the scene of the cruel flame. Conversely, from Ovid's text, rather than screaming, Marsyas contemplates another domain, existent. This is very Lacanian. This is the only Lacanian word I'll be using, that exists outside. So existent from his punishment and the scene that constitutes it. Indeed, his detached gaze not only points to an invisible, transcendent domain, but moreover promotes a splitting of the atrociously flayed body and this other dimension he somehow has access to. In a psychoanalytic vocabulary, we call this domain that of the impossible, of a beyond the limits, the Rio in Lacanian terms, which escapes all representation. That is where both Marsyas and Murdoch's gaze point us to. Can we have slide number 9, which is a key concept by Lacan that I'll give you some time to read and dilute as you can manage to in such short time. The key concept here is Lacan's differentiation between the look and the gaze, right? Which is luded. That's my concept, the concept I'm using here of the gaze. A parenthetical parallel might be at the back of our minds and your minds as you follow me, which would be slide number 10. Christ hung on the cross. In passing, the tragic element has gone, and instead we have pity for someone who, despite his unwillingness, has followed his father's orders, supposedly to redeem and save humanity. He bears no responsibility. He was just following orders and submitted himself to them. This is far removed from the scope of tragedy, I would argue. Such is not the case of Marsyas. As a semi-divine figure, he has what the Christian tradition has erased or bleached from its canon. Full of hybris and having found Athena's allos, he developed a masterly command of the instrument, and he defies Apollo in one of the latter's sovereign fields, music. It is art, not salvation, not redemption, that is at stake here in Marsyas' case. Moreover, the satyr's hybris leads him to a sort of hamartia, that is, to reach the limits of his excellence and to believe he could overpass it. The relation of the hero with limits is an aspect that lies at the very core of tragic foundations, especially of the tragic hero, as we all know. Marsyas' excess, and this is an aspect that also Italy Calvino calls attention to, is an attribute that is extended to Ovid's entire poem. But this excess leads him to overflow limits and bear the painful consequences of his choice. To dare to go beyond what is right, good, the just measure, is at the same time both an unsustainable transgression as well as a space of freedom that few can attain. Tragedy shows this like any other literary genre, I would argue. The pain that derives from the excess, followed by this unspeakable cruelty, which was the critic's expression, can only reach the domain of the speakable and the visible due to its aesthetic transfiguration. Metamorphosis is a poignant term to describe this artistic process. Art, and I now add it openly, the psychoanalytic process can enact this dialectical procedure. They take characters and patients, especially those in formation to occupy the place of the analyst. They lead them to bypass limits. It is from this fleeing position, and it is a fleeing position, that they can transfigure the place of the impossible horror, of the unspeakable real, of ex nihilo, with the veil of creation, in particular, the creation of beauty. It is not the conflation of kalos kagathos, but of other attributes, pain being one of the key ones. There is a terse question voiced by Marsyas. Can we have slide number 11, please, Eduardo? Which has opened up this my entire line of cumulative, free associative meditation that I have been developing here. I find this one of the most intriguing verses. Why do you tear me from myself? Is one of the possible translations. In Portuguese, we have Por que me arrancas de mim mesmo are two possible translations, not only due to its fierce concision, but moreover, because it hits the very core of the metamorphotic process, which forcefully entails transgression, loss, existence, so as to reach any sort of transformation. In other words, Marcia's questions highlights a splitting between the person, both of the artist and the psychoanalyst, and the craft they dedicate themselves to at the very moment that it is taking place. This is simply brilliant. The two pronouns, me, he, are not separated in the Latin syntax as they are in the English and the Brazilian translations. But the grammar performs the act of tearing them apart, of splitting the subject, as his gaze had already indicated. In two other grammars, the artistic and the psychoanalytic ones, the ego is declined in the accusative and the dative, and never conjugated in the nominative, even though we do have lots of ego battles in both fields. The ego is not a master in his own house. This is one of Freud's most well-known dictums. That Freud said that as soon as he discovered or invented the notion of the unconscious, the ego is not master in his own house. We have that in Ovid already. This acute differentiation does not escape Iris Murdoch. After declaring, and I use her expression, the death of the ego, and the author, we should amend with Roland Barthes, she goes on to say that the ego disappears and you see the world with absolute vividness and clarity, unquote, with enargeia, I would argue. And she admits that it was only after she saw Tiziano's painting that she could realize this splitting between the person and the creative subject. In my case, such an awareness came first and foremost as part of my formation as a psychoanalyst, and lately in my adventures as an occasional actress, as some of you know. But in both cases, I should underline, it took place within the framework of pain and beauty, which in an analytic vocabulary we would call jouissance. In English, we use the French term, in Portuguese, gozo, in Italian, godimento. So this is a key concept. And one final question, nearly done, remains open for debate. From which position can Marcia formulate the question he poses to Apollo? Why do you tear me apart? From what I have sketched above, his face points towards this other subjective position one can attain after the complex process of flaying, or a Freudian term, castration, of transitioning. In this respect, Marcia's is a trans subject. I take this notion from the Sino-French poet François Cheng. What is a trans subject in Cheng's concept, following Cheng's concept? It's someone who has overflown limits to the point that he or she must be transformed into a flowing stream in a Heraclitean process of transformation. A trans subject enacting the very act of transfiguration, essential to any creative act. So it moves us and displaces a plurality of beings that we have in Tiziano's painting that surround Marsyas. As Ovid points out, that would be slide number 12, his transposition. Eduardo, can we have slide 12, please? His transposition changes these beings. Eduardo, are you with me? Yes. Okay, great. Thank you. Okay, this is Ovid pointing out that this transposition changes the beings around Marsyas into tears, into water, and sent forth in the free air, or as the Brazilian translation holds, enviou-as para o espaço vazio. Remember my epigraphs? Okay, from this unfathomable void, from this airy nothing, other acts of creation and transformation can emerge, so that we can evoke Dante's plea. That will be the last slide. Being in Italy, I could only end with Dante. Dante's plea, and look forward to a beyond the frame of our present event, to future acts and moments of recreation and transformation. Thank you very much.
Grazie tante. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Dizemos nós, obrigado. Agora que nós entendemos o sentido de várias línguas do godimento e por que a fala foi tão motivada, vindo de Venezia, e com toda essa profusão de imagens, acredito que o debate será muito vivo. Deixemos para, então, essa parte que virá já já. Eu passo de imediato a apresentar o nosso segundo convidado da mesa. Peço desculpas que o smartphone está fechando aqui com a minha colinha. Bom, o Professor Martin doesn't like me calling him professor, but I don't have a choice. Martin knows it. So, as he understands Portuguese very well, I present him briefly in the language of Machado de Assis. O professor Martin Winkler é professor universitário da área de estudos clássicos na Universidade George Mesa, instituição na qual é o coordenador do programa de estudos clássicos e de estudos latinos. Ele atua nas áreas de literatura grega e romana, mitologia clássica, história romana, tradição clássica, além dos seus estudos de recepção de literatura clássica, sua história e seus mitos no cinema. Ele é autor de mais de 100 artigos, livros, capítulos de livros e críticas sobre os temas e áreas citados, dentre os quais, singelamente, eu destaco aqui o seu livro mais recente, Ouvi on Screen, A Montage of Attractions, que foi publicado em 2020 pela Universidade de Cambridge, pela editora da Universidade de Cambridge. So, Martin, thank you very much for your presence in this symposium, and the word is yours.
Thank you very kindly, Professor Edson, for this introduction. Before I turn on the screen sharing as part of my presentation, let me say first, boa tarde a todos. It's very nice to be back in Brazil, if only virtually, but perhaps also virtuously. And I'm particularly struck by the wide variety of the contributions that this conference has already presented. Thanks mainly to the organizers, whom I need not particularly mention, since they have been mentioned many times before. So let me just mention as a representative for all of them, one whose first name begins, or second first name, I should say, begins with the letter C. And I'm saying this because there are two other words in Brazilian that are my favorites that also begin with the letter C. So the person I have in mind is obviously our own Cecilia. And the other two words, in case you're interested, that begin with the letter C in Portuguese are capivara and caipirinha. And with this, you have already heard pretty much the extent of my knowledge of Portuguese. I confess to a little bit of a misgiving in starting my presentation today, because I am speaking after the particularly learned presentation by Anna, who is a difficult act to follow. But I will at least try. So let me see if I can do the screen sharing. Oops. Is anything to be seen actually?
Not yet. Oh, okay.
Yeah, okay, just okay.
Okay, then let me wait, turn this on to play. Okay, is that better?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, can everybody hear me? Good, then allow me to begin. In Book 8 of the Metamorphoses, Ovid has immortalized Daedalus and Icarus, the first human aviators in the Western imagination, as exemplars of ingenuity and daring. They also became the mythical ancestors of modern technological innovators. So it is not surprising that the myth about the first human flight should have been associated with a new technology, that of storytelling in moving images. In a 1946 essay called The Myth of Total Cinema, French film scholar André Bazin referred to Icarus and Plato to characterize the cinema. I won't read all this to save time, but notice that he says, he calls it an idealistic phenomenon, which means it existed, pre-existed before the technology. Classical Greece and Rome have always been among the most versatile sources of inspiration for filmmakers. A remarkable example is Ovid. Many of the myths to which he gave definitive shape have been adapted to the screen, most frequently in modern versions. The Orpheus and Eurydice myth, for example, is among Ovid's most enduring tales. Milestones in film history are Jean Cocteau's Orphée from 1950 and, known to everybody in Brazil, obviously, Marcel Camus' Orfeu Negro, like Orpheus from 1959. My presentation today is intended to point out, by only a few examples, of its importance for the cinema, much in the manner in which a trailer whets audiences' appetites for a full-fledged epic. That full-fledged epic, in my case, has this for its poster, if you forgive me the self-advertisement. What I say today is based on this book, obviously, which is the real thing. It was released 2.5 years ago, or almost 2.5 years ago, by, dare I say this, MCM, Metro Cambridge Martin. It's also been reviewed a few, 4 or 5 times, including by our own Julia. Muito obrigado, Julia. Literary translations and adaptations are obvious forms of verbal metamorphosis. The term metamorphosis can usefully be applied to adaptations from page to screen as well. Film versions of texts necessarily impose extensive changes on their sources. For this reason, films of literature are not translations, but indeed metamorphoses. Since they follow their own rules, we might call them, as I have done in this book, cinemetamorphoses, Let me add in parentheses that the book was originally to be called Cinemetamorphosis plus a subtitle. But I was absolutely forbidden from using that word by the press because they thought nobody would understand what that means. A present company obviously accepted. Now, since Ovid is the poet of metamorphoses par excellence, I would like to turn to the Ovidian nature of cinema by discussing a few cinemetamorphoses of Ovidian themes. I begin with Italian poet, playwright, and novelist Gabriele D'Annunzio, Italy's foremost man of letters in the late 18th and early 19th. Oops, I take that back. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, commonly called Il Vate, the Vates. He became fascinated with the cinema because of Ovid. A particular essay by D'Annunzio had this title, I quote, Del cinematografo considerato come strumento di liberazione e come arte di trasfigurazione. Or in English, on the film camera considered as instrument of liberation and art of transformation. Here D'Annunzio explained his interest in the cinema and referred to the painting that you saw at the beginning in my title slide. Again, I don't need to read this here. Please notice that he talks about a new aesthetic of movement and that he exclaims, Ovid's metamorphosis, a true subject for the camera. And he was particularly smitten with the story of Daphne. I go into further detail about this in the book. The painting that he refers to, Antonio del Pollaiuolo, here it is one more time. For us, what counts most is D'Annunzio's tribute to Ovid as a Vates of cinema. Let me give you another quote from D'Annunzio. I never stopped thinking of Daphne's delicate arm, changed into a leafy branch. The true and unique virtue of the film camera is metamorphosis. In Italian, he says, trasfigurazione again. And Ovid is its poet. Sooner or later, the poetry of the metamorphoses will enchant the masses, not just academics like us, but the masses in the sense of people who go to the movies and so on, for entertainment, popular culture purposes. Now, the earliest master of screen metamorphosis was French filmmaker Georges Méliès, the first wizard of film, as his friends affectionately have called him for decades, and still call him so today. He worked principally with multiple exposures and superimpositions. Méliès repeatedly told stories that are set in or otherwise take up themes and figures from antiquity. Méliès once explained how he discovered the camera's power of transformation. So again, please quickly read through this. Notice that it begins with a kind of accident. The camera jammed, a trolley changed into a hearse, men changed into women, and then when he saw this, the exposed film himself, 2 days later, I produced the first metamorphoses. In fact, in the French original, I believe he does call them metamorphoses. One trick led to another, something everyone declared to be impossible before they saw it. Here it is. He's understandably proud of his achievement. In other words, he discovered a new way of seeing, or rather of showing and then seeing, the way he showed it and the way audiences saw this. I'm sure that many of you will be reminded of the short book by John Berger, the British culture critic and also filmmaker, by the way, Ways of Seeing, in which he says the camera changed the way people saw everything. So with Méliès, then, here we have, with this discovery, the very origin of cinemetamorphosis in a literal sense. As early as 1898, and that's only 3 years or 2.5 years after the first public showing of films by the Lumiere brothers, as early as 1898, Méliès had made the first ever film about Pygmalion. In 1903, he made a film called La Statue Animée, the animated statue, which survives, fortunately, almost completely. Statues come to life in a great number of Méliès's films. So we may agree with an art historian who has observed that with Méliès, there came, I quote, a passage of inanimate to animated, end quote, and another quote, and from marble to celluloid. In the 20th century alone, Ovid's tale of Pygmalion became famous thanks to George Bernard Shaw's play Pygmalion from 1912. its classic film adaptation of 1938, and most famously, perhaps, the worldwide phenomenon of Leonard Lowell's My Fair Lady from 1956 and filmed in 1964. The cinema, a French scholar has concluded, has a veritable Pygmalion complex. Actually, it has several other complexes as well. One of them I have called the Daedalus complex, and alternatively, the Hephaestus complex. Both mortal Daedalus and divine Hephaestus fashioned statues called Daedala in Greek, after Daedalus, the Greek form, the original form of Daedalus' name, are statues that could move. The cinema can easily animate the inanimate. A case in point is the Hellenistic Discobolos by the Greek sculptor Myron, which survives only in Roman and modern copies. The original has been lost. It comes to human life as part of the prologue to Leni Riefenstahl's 1938 two-part epic Olympia, about the Olympic Summer Games in Berlin in 1936. Let me show you a brief excerpt. My favorite screen example, however, from inanimate to animate, appeared in 1927 in a film directed in Germany by Fritz Lang, his silent science fiction epic Metropolis. I do not have the time to go into the story. It's a very long film, but let me show you three excerpts that involve metamorphoses. The first is of an eerie inventor, or shows you an eerie inventor called Rotwang in German, which is kind of ironical because Rotwang means red cheek, and he lives in a subterranean kind of a cave-like environment. He's actually very pale. Rotwang has fashioned a female robot whose facial features resemble those of the woman whom he had loved, but lost to his rival, a man called Fredersen, the master and owner of Metropolis, a big industrialist. First, as we will see, Rotwang is showing Fredersen the robot for the first time. Note in this excerpt also the atmospheric music composed by Gottfried Huppertz. I want to emphasize this because I would like to remind everybody that silent films are never silent. There's always, or virtually always, at least music. So here we go. Well, let me stop here. Clearly, the cinema is much indebted to this film. If you remember the film by Alex Garland from a few years ago called Ex Machina, you have an example of how the machine man can barely be distinguished from a real person. And since Anna in her presentation rightfully emphasized the duality, the horrifying and the beautiful in connection with Titian's painting, perhaps you may agree, and perhaps even Anna will agree, if I mention that I find this face of the robot also both eerie and terrifying and scary and very, very attractive. Or am I just saying this about myself? I'm giving away way too much about myself. Well, in any case, Fredersen, the industrialist, will use this robot as a means to rule the masses of workers whom he has been exploiting. The robot will take on the appearance of the heroine of the story, the good and virginal Maria. She's called Maria, of course, because of the Christian connotations. I have never seen, with maybe 2 or 3 exceptions at the most, a film in which an evil woman is called Maria. If you can think of one, please let me know. The false and evil Maria, in other words, the one that whose shape and appearance the robot assumes, the false and evil Maria will be a vamp and lure men to their doom as vamps do. Here, in a longer clip, I would like to show you the metamorphosis of the robot into Maria, who has been kidnapped for the purpose. She's a sort of innocent and helpless victim of the machinations of Rotwang and Fredersen. This is a longer scene because I would like to impress on you the amazing technology from 1927. This was cutting-edge, state-of-the-art technology. Note that the chief emphasis is on the transformation of the face. So it may be instructive now to juxtapose the elaborate and, for its time, technically cutting-edge metamorphosis in Metropolis that you just saw with a radically different one from the early modern era of the cinema. Oh, I'm sorry, we have one more. Here it is. This is the reverse, my mistake, the reverse transformation. So the essence of the apparently good Maria is really the evil Robert who now, when she's being burnt at the stake, he comes through again. My apologies for the glitch. So it will be, I hope, instructive if we compare particularly the facial aspects in the Metamorphoses in Metropolis with the one in Ingmar Bergman's Persona from 1966. In this film, the personalities of two women become one. The two women are a stage actress who has suffered a nervous breakdown and is now staying at a quiet retreat, and the nurse who looks after her. Director Bergman on the right, and his cinematographer Sven Nykvist, one of the great masters, show us the decisive moment. So let me briefly show you this now. The name Elisabeth Vogler is the name of the actress played by Liv Ullmann, and the nurse is played by Bibi Andersson, who died a few years recently, two of the great female actors in Bergman's cinema. Now, in Ovid, Metamorphosis brings a character's mental or emotional state to the surface and makes it visible, and so do both these films. In Metropolis, an evil essence is hidden under or disguised as a virtuous outside. In Persona, the nurse, already susceptible to the actress's, well, persona, identifies with her so closely that the personalities represented by their faces actually fuse. American Ovid scholar Joseph Solado wrote in his book on Ovid, I quote, "Metamorphosis regularly makes essence visible, plain, clear." More specifically, please read the text for yourselves. Notice that he says, a change which preserves, an alteration which maintains identity. One particular film may serve as an apt illustration. This is Darren Aronofsky's film Black Swan from 2010. Black Swan achieves its emotional power by means of computer-generated special effects. In Metamorphoses 2, 7, and 12, Ovid tells three stories in which a young man called Swan, Gygnos, is changed into this bird, the bird whose name he bears. Black Swan tells a modern story. A rather high-strung young ballerina gets a chance to play Odile, the Black Swan, in Tchaikovsky's Swan Lake. The physical strain that the role demands from her, and to say nothing about her stage-obsessed mother, and the emotional toll that it takes on her psyche lead to a series of hallucinations. She discovers disturbing changes in herself, such as small black feathers protruding from under her skin. Is she now, under all that psychological strain, actually turning into the Black Swan? So it appears, because everything we see on screen is presented as if it were real. That is to say, there are no indications that what we watch the dancer discovering about herself is not objective or factual, although these are subjective images revealing her inner state. With Black Swan, we do not always know where reality ends and imagination begins, even though we remain fully aware that a combination of human and animal bodies is realistically impossible, particularly in the 20th century or 21st century. The dancer's gradual metamorphosis remains incomplete, but what we see on screen is the sort of physical embodiment of an emotional state of which we read again and again in Ovid. The climax of the dancer's process of transformation comes on opening night. Rallying her last resources, she whirls onto the stage, and we follow her metamorphosis from a human moving like a swan into a part human and part animal creature. The dancer's intermediate stage fully conforms to Ovidian metamorphosis. As one scholar has put it, I quote, Ovid is particularly drawn to describing in-between states, usually during the process of transformation. So let me next show you this moment of her transformation at the climax of Swan Lake. The long shot of the dancer taken her bow, please look at the image here, is from the ballet audience's point of view. It tells us that the metamorphosis we just witnessed has not been real. We now realize that all the earlier swan-like features on the dancer's body had been the outward manifestation of her inner state, which Aronofsky had made visible to us. The animal features we have seen realistically had not really appeared on the body at all. The two states of reality and psychology have fused into realistic images of irreality. The long shot cleverly preserves, as you see right here, the fusion of both states. We see her in full human shape, legs and arms, head and everything. Where was it? We see her in full human shape, but the two shadows that she casts on the wall behind her display large wings. The moment signals to us how intense her emotional state must have been. The content of her mind is still swan-like, rendered as the animal shadows cast by her human body. I think this is a terrific use of CGI too. Many of you will have recognized Natalie Portman as the actress. She won an Academy Award for this part, deservedly so. Let me now return to Daedalus. His labyrinth, as described in Metamorphosis Book 8, has served modern and postmodern literary scholars and theorists as an analogy to intricate literary narratives and as a symbol of the autonomy of a text over its author. Daedalus builds a complicated structure of, it says, a multiplex domus. His design is fiendishly clever, for, I quote in translation, he leads one's gaze astray with twisted curves of different mysteriously winding passages, or in Latin, lumina flexu ducit in error rem variar ambage viarum. The simile of the meander, the river that flows backwards and forwards, as if it were leading itself astray, vividly expresses the intricacy of Daedalus' creation. With its changeable and uncertain flow, as Ovid calls it, its ambiguo lapsu, the meander proceeds just as anyone inside the labyrinth would stumble along, directionless, coming back to the same spot again and again, utterly helpless. Let me stop for just a second, if you don't mind, to tell you a bit of about a personal experience that I've had. Many archaeologists and myth scholars and such have considered the ruins at Knossos, or rather before they were ruins, as the myth about the labyrinth as represented in the archaeology of Knossos, the mythical palace of King Minos. The first time I was at Knossos, I wandered off all by myself. I went down the stairs and wandered around, and I had such an experience. I couldn't find, at least for a while, I couldn't find my way back. And it was only through the help of my patron goddess, Athena, that I am here being able to tell you about that and all these other things. Well, in any case, a complex narrative line, as scholars often call it, symbolized by Ariadne's thread, that Theseus unspools inside the labyrinth, that it falls back on itself. Of its language illustrates and exemplifies the labyrinth's complex nature with its own complex syntax and word order. A milestone of modernist cinema is last year at Marienbad, 1961, L'année dernière à Marienbad, written by Alain Robbe-Grillet and directed by Alain Resnais. Now, these two are often affectionately called the two Alains, les deux Alains. The film is an enigmatic tale about mysterious characters set in a secluded chateau-like hotel of Baroque splendor. This is its most iconic image, most famous one, the park. Now notice the shadows. Only the people cast shadows, but nothing else. And that's almost an enigmatic riddle in itself, although we do know how René achieved this effect. The chateau is a multiplex domus too, whose rooms and corridors appear to be endless and may lead nowhere. A roving camera explores them extensively and intensely, but viewers rarely know where exactly the inhabitants are. At the beginning, a man's voice on the soundtrack describes to an as yet unseen listener the surroundings and the eerie effect that they have. He does so rather obsessively, returning to the same phrases again and again. Let me show you a brief excerpt of this opening sequence, and I've put the translation of what the man says under the image. Like Ovid's meander and the corridors in Daedalus' labyrinth, the man's words and the film's narrative circle back on themselves again and again, as if there were no escape from time or place. So do the images. They repeatedly show us where we have already been. If the corridors and galleries, with side corridors branching off, remind us of Ovid's description of Daedalus' labyrinth, so the virtuoso eloquence of René's visuals may be comparable to the verbal virtuosity in Ovid. If you agree with me on this, then with this point of view, then you might also consider the formal elegance of the film's cinematography by the great Sacha Vernet and René's clever editing as filmic equivalents of Ovid's stylistic and syntactic elegance. But what about Ariadne's thread? For this aspect, I turn to Italian director and previously cinematographer Mario Bava and his thriller, The Girl Who Knew Too Much, La ragazza che sapeva troppo, from 1963. Bava pays homage, and not only with its title, to Alfred Hitchcock, the master of suspense. Bava's film, in its most iconic sequence, the one that I will show you, shows us a tangible analogy to the kind of narrative thread that characterizes all mystery plots on page and screen. In the story, a young American woman who is an avid reader of detective novels travels to Rome and gets involved in a bizarre series of murders. She soon begins to suspect that the killer, who has long eluded the police, is now after her. She's staying by herself in a lonely apartment, which has its own sinister history. Scared at night, she begins to think of ways to protect herself. She hits on just the right idea, to take inspiration from her beloved thrillers. She had just finished a brand new mystery novel called Ariadne's Terrible Thread. Inspired by it, our plucky heroine first pours a generous amount of talcum powder on the stone floor inside the apartment entrance to make it slippery. Then she ties a tenacious tangle of string, as the film's narrator calls it, to various pieces of furniture, potted plants, doorknobs, piles of household objects throughout the apartment. The narrator informs us, I quote in translation, killers never read mysteries, fortunately. He also tells us that Ariadne's Terrible Thread has just been published in the US and so cannot yet have reached Italy, which means that had the killer read this mystery, then he would know how to deal with the situation. But since he hasn't, he won't. Let me add, however, that in reality, this is a fictitious novel. There is no such book, sad to say. Bava started as a cinematographer, as I said, and here he shot his own film in almost gothic black and white. And he particularly rises to the occasion in this particular suspenseful scene. So let me show you this. Excellently done. It's both scary and funny. Now, if last year at Marienbad was too cerebral and The Girl Who Knew Too Much too scary for you, here is another and totally different labyrinth from 10 years ago. Wrath of the Titans is the sequel to the remake of the classic Clash of the Titans from 1980, which had gorgeous stop-motion special effects by the great and immortal Ray Harryhausen. Now computer-generated images rule, as this new labyrinth shows quite effectively. And that is the most attractive feature of the whole film, which otherwise is rather mediocre. I've selected two parts from a longer sequence to give you an idea of its labyrinth. Here's the first. What happens next is predictably that our hero encounters a minotaur and, of course, kills him. Let me show you now quickly what happens after that, which is quite impressive in terms of the computer-generated labyrinth imagery. Well, as you see, it's not Theseus as in myth, but Perseus who kills or has killed the Minotaur. Well, let me next turn to an Ovidian moment in one of the films by the master of suspense himself, Alfred Hitchcock. The speaker, and I do this in connection with Ovid's Amadeus 1.5. The speaker of Amadeus 1.5 introduces Corinna, his beloved, and describes their erotic encounter when she unexpectedly visits him as he is lying drowsy on his bed during the noonday heat. The appearance of Corinna has a close parallel in Hitchcock's Rear Window, 1954, despite obvious differences between the time and the setting of Amadeus 1.5 and this film. For an instant, both works evoke a comparable atmosphere of charged eroticism. That Rear Window is also a murder mystery, as this German poster nicely shows you, I leave out of consideration. A photojournalist, his leg in a cast, is confined to a small apartment in a tenement building in Greenwich Village. There is a heat wave. In Ovid's poem, we read Eis tus erat. The photographer is half asleep in his wheelchair in the late afternoon, shortly before dusk. The setting in Ovid, with one side of the window open, the other closed, is comparable to that in Rear Window. The setting in Ovid makes for a chiaroscuro effect of subdued light like that in a forest, which is not applicable to Rear Window, or like that at dawn or dusk, which is. Ovid's expression sub lucent crepuscula, dim twilight shines faintly, is a near perfect description of the light just before dusk in Rear Window. The unexpected shadow that then falls across the drowsing photographer's face is the equivalent of Ovid's Ecke, look, at the beginning of line 9. The visual force of Ecke is revealed on screen with a cut from the man's face, partly obscured by the shadow of the head of someone as yet unidentified, to a frontal view of the visitor's face. So after this preparation, let me show you briefly this moment. Corinna's entrance in Ovid's poem, like Lisa's in the film, resembles a theophany. Hitchcock stylizes Lisa's kiss in a manner that elevates her to the level of a superhuman being, descending from above. Hitchcock presents Lisa by means of staggered editing, as it is usually called. The effect is achieved when certain frames within the shot are later printed twice in the laboratory, so that a naturally fluid motion looks slightly jerky, although it remains graceful. But it no longer seems completely natural. We are jolted just for a moment out of the familiar ways in which we experience our surroundings. Hitchcock did 27 takes of the kissing scene in order to get it exactly right. Notoriously, and that is a pun intended, Hitchcock fell in love with his beautiful leading ladies, especially blondes. This circumstance may help explain the exquisite stylization of Grace Kelly's, I quote, sexual elegance, as Hitchcock himself put it, in Rear Window. The actress's first name fits the character she plays. With her heavenly grace, Lisa appears like a mirage. The elegant eroticism, subdued but still palpable as it is in Rear Window, leads me to the Ovidian theme of love and desire. I cannot here go into details about Ovid, as in his own words, a tenerorum lusor amorum, who exhorts his readers, I quote, vati parete perito vera canam, and who can advise them about how to fall in, or if necessary, out of love. Even his Metamorphoses, as you know, is full of love stories. The extremely complex and sophisticated structure of Ovid's epic is familiar to all. In romantic, erotic, and playfully elegant cinema, there's only one film that I know, which, although on a much smaller scale, it is not an epic, is comparable in both word and image. This is La Ronde, directed in 1950 in France by German expatriate director Max Ophüls and based on a work by Arthur Schnitzler called Der Reigen, La Ronde. Here, the roundelay of love and desire is set in motion and kept going by a highly Ovidian sophisticate. He serves as the master of the game of love. The opening scene, which I will show you, shows the carousel as a symbol of the interlocking episodes that will follow. Note in particular the effortless elegance with which Ophüls takes us into the story set in the Vienna of 1900. Ophüls also draws attention to the artificiality of the cinema medium. And let me add that the music you will hear, the waltz, is composed by Oskar Strauss. So let me show you the opening scene. And this is the first of the love stories in the roundelay of love, the young girl and the soldier. But you may now ask, why is the cinema the ideal and irresistible medium to show us love stories and, of course, other stories, action, adventures, mysteries? The cinema itself once answered this question. The answer can be heard at the beginning of Jean-Luc Godard's 1963 film, Le Mépris, Contempt, in a quotation wrongly attributed to André Bazin, whom I quoted at the beginning of my presentation. Let me show you very briefly this moment in Le Mépris. The man behind the camera, by the way, is Raoul Coutard, the great cinematographer of the French New Wave. To translate what the narrator has said, the cinema presents to our gaze an alternate world that conforms to our desires. Here is my own attempt of translating this into classical Greek. And I adopted this many years ago as a kind of personal maxim. In La Ronde, the meneur de la Ronde de l'amour had said something comparable to us. I quote in translation, I am the incarnation of your desire. In this way, he becomes the incarnation or personification of cinema, Monsieur Cinéma lui-même. The word of the cinema is the word of desire. The word of desire, logically, is the word of the cinema. In Le Mépris, the cyclopean eye of the film camera looms above us, a fitting epic and classical conclusion to my presentation, although more Homeric than Ovidian. Ovid's proud affirmation, Legar, I shall be read, in the penultimate line of the Metamorphoses, can today be expanded to include spectabor, I shall be watched. D'Annunzio was right in regarding Ovid as the Vates of cinema. The art of the cinema, in Ovid's language, ars cinematographica, is the art of the changing image, the art of visual metamorphosis. Therefore, it is an ars Ovidiana. So allow me to end with a homage to Ovidius Kinematographicus, as we might call him, in his own language. I've only added one word to his second line. In nova fert animus mutatas dicere formas corpora moventia. Or, to adapt what we heard in La Ronde, le meneur de la ronde cinématographique, c'est bien sûr notre Ovid. Having said all this, I now call on a cinematic muse, in this case Hollywood's terpsichore, to inform you that I and you have reached the end. Thank you very much for your attention. Muito obrigado.
Muito obrigado, Martin. Já que ele não gosta que eu chame ele de professor, ele gosta que eu chame ele de Carinha. Então, obrigado, Carinha. E eu passo a palavra para a professora Cecília. Você quer falar, Cecília, pelo horário? Eu não sei como é que a gente vai proceder, se temos tempo para o debate. Por gentileza, nos esclareça.
Bom, oficialmente, em primeiro lugar, muito obrigada, Ana e o Martin. A gente tem até 18h15, né? Mas eu acho que tem uma questão, talvez se a Ana quiser responder, se tiverem questões para o Martin e para a Ana, outras, pelo menos mais 5 minutos a gente poderia ficar, né? Muito obrigada.
Ana, você consegue ver a pergunta no chat ou você quer que eu leia para você?
Eu posso fazer a pergunta também, se quiser que faça ao vivo.
Ai, que bom que você está
Porque
aí. Assim.
Eu tenho 5 minutos e vou ter que sair, mas assim, eu acho que ao vivo é mais legal. Pode ser? Então tá.
Sim.
A Ana tá só no mudo, né?
Pronto. Estou te ouvindo melhor, porque pelo chat eu estou numa coisinha muito pequena, não consigo ler o que está escrito.
Não, tá joia. É porque primeiro, muito obrigada pela apresentação, parabéns, assim. Além do conteúdo maravilhoso, você é linda, elegante, maravilhosa, fiquei encantada, já para começar. Mas durante toda a apresentação, uma coisa que me chamou muita atenção e não conseguia sair da minha cabeça era o conceito do instant prégnant, do Lessing. E eu fiquei pensando se o instant prégnant não seria justamente uma forma de metamorfose, já que ele transforma o que é estático em movimento. Então, é escolher dentro do movimento, decompor o movimento, escolher aquele instante ideal para representar na pintura ou na escultura, que são obras estáticas, e assim causar no espectador a sensação de movimento. Então, diante de tudo aquilo que você falou, e no quadro do Tiziano, eu fiquei pensando se esse conceito de instant prégnant estaria diretamente ligado à metamorfose e dentro de tudo que você falou.
Olha, muito obrigada pela pergunta. Na verdade, eu acho que é muito mais um comentário que enriquece extremamente. Não tinha pensado no conceito de instant prégnant, mas acho que é justamente isso, é o corte, o momento do congelamento no meio do movimento e que reinstaura o movimento. É, de alguma forma, muito profundamente dialético, né? Porque você interrompe instaura. Ao mesmo tempo que você corta, você continua. É linda a sua leitura. Muito obrigada. Super obrigada.
Ah, imagina. É porque na minha tese, a minha área é cinema, então não é a sua área, a minha área é cinema, mas eu trabalhei com as Tampriand, mas muito mais como uma metáfora do que como o próprio. Mas é um conceito que me fascina, justamente porque ele traz essa dualidade meio paradoxal, porque você parte daquela coisa completamente estática e transforma o estático em movimento, ele ainda é estático, porque a pintura continua lá, estática aos nossos olhos, mas ela, no nosso cérebro, ela vira movimento, né? Então, enfim, eu pensei nisso ouvindo sua palestra o tempo todo, eu estava com o Samprenhan na minha cabeça.
E o Samprenhan, eu acho que Lacan deve ter sido tributário desse conceito, porque quando ele propõe, por exemplo, o corte da sessão, que é uma coisa muito mal vista, é para justamente causar este efeito. Você corta ali para que haja um movimento, para que o movimento continue e não congele, fixe o sujeito em uma posição, na posição da queixa, do sofrimento. Então, é algo completamente cinematográfico, maravilhoso. Realmente vou tomar nota, porque é riquíssimo o seu comentário. Muito obrigada.
Ah, legal. Que bom. Era...
Eu estou sem...
Obrigada.
Está congelando.
Está falhando, né? Acho que a minha conexão está falhando.
Falhou um pouquinho.
Ou a minha conexão, não sei, falhou.
Eu acho que a minha ficou instável, mas agora voltou. Mas eu agradeço muito, então, e vou ficar pensando no Samprenhan e em tudo que você falou, tá tudo anotado. E professor Martin Winkler,
muito
thank you very much.
Obrigado.
E eu estava ouvindo, eu pensando no Samprenhan e ouvindo tudo que o Martin estava falando e a minha cabeça estava indo a mil, ficando louca. Muito, muito obrigada por essa tarde maravilhosa.
Thank you. Remember that these were only Prolegomena and not the real thing.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Obrigada.
Bom, Cecília, te devolvo a palavra de novo. Só anoto aqui que as pessoas estão maravilhadas pela qualidade do evento aqui no chat, né? A Carolina Caio da Costa, não sei como se pronuncia, diz: por favor, me convidem para todos os eventos como esse. A Vivian também. Oi, Vivian. Oi, Rodrigo. Eu vi que vocês comentaram aqui. Saudade de vocês. A Vivian diz que o evento foi muito rico. O Rodrigo agradece ao Martin pela sua fala. O próprio Martin agradece ao público. Obrigado for the kind comments.
Yes, thank you very much.
Eu agradeço a cada pessoa que teve a paciência de ouvir-nos por tanto tempo.
Acho que tem Eduardo, mas Edson, é muito fácil fazer eventos maravilhosos com tantas pessoas maravilhosas. Esse é o privilégio aqui de ter tantas pessoas queridas, competentes, maravilhosas. Obrigada a todos, palestrantes, interrogações, mas acho que vou passar aqui a pergunta.
Sim.
Obrigado, Maria Cecília. Eu tenho duas questões, mas a primeira é para o Martin. E I read because my English no como how say in Italian non bello troppo. Thanks very much for your presentation, Professor Winkler. This is a real opportunity for me, and I would like to talk about our film screening that took place last week here at FMG. This event called Cinea and was part of this symposium. We exhibition screened all these films that you showed us today, and the debates were also based on your analysis, mainly in his book, Ouvi on Screen. we had debates for 1 hour about these films, and it was
nice.
fascinating.
Mhm.
So thank you for this beautiful work. And I return for my question because in my reflection between cinema, metamorphoses, and myths, I found the concept of Deleuze and Guattari called rhizoma.
Mhm.
This is a kind of map of probably encounters, meetings, meetings. And my question is about this. Would it be cinema, this place of the probably encounters of the myths, and because this powerful transformation of the myth?
Well, first, thank you for the question, Eduardo. It's a very complex one altogether, really. Secondly, before I try to answer it, let me add that your English is perfectly okay and better, so no hesitation, please. And thank you also for your kind comments about my my own work. I am not primarily oriented in terms of film theory and criticism, although of course I do, as with Barzin, very often refer to them and quote them. My approach is mainly sort of a traditional philological one, working with the text, an explication de texte, and in this case, an explication de texte filmique, one might say, a filmic explanation of these texts. And I think this is appropriate, not only for classical literature, but really for all literature, because great literature is, in the manner of speaking, so vivid. Anna, and I think others too, have earlier mentioned the term enargeia. That goes back to Homeric storytelling, actually, the vividness of putting things before the reader's mental eyes. So when you read a great author, be it Ovid, be it Homer, be it Virgil, be it Dickens, and so on, you see what you're reading. It's like a mental movie that is unspooling in our heads. In fact, I tell my students quite often, they don't always believe me, at least not at first. I tell them, if you do not see mentally what you're reading, you're not reading it right. Or, other possibility, you're reading a really dumb storyteller, an incompetent author, which in our case obviously is not the case. So in film theory, in the 1950s, actually a French a scholar or an art historian, Pierre Franck, I think his first name was Pierre Franck Castel, coined the expression le pré-cinéma, pre-cinema. And that set in motion a large amount of work by literary scholars and art historians on cinematic aspects in literature, including classical literature. And that is perhaps more to the point of how I approach this myself. So in other words, to end this somewhat inadequate answer to your question, Eduardo, let me remind you or adduce again what André Bazin said in this, I think, seminal essay of his from 1946, that the cinema is an idealistic phenomenon, that you can have the concept of storytelling in images and storytelling in words, which then in a reader's head or listener's head originally turn into films, into moving images. There's no problem with this, and there's no question about this. There's also nothing anachronistic, because people have been doing this from the very beginning, and even the very earliest works of art. Your prehistoric cave paintings of animals running or being hunted and so on show bodies in motion. So this concept of moving or showing motion in static images as an ancient art, or showing motion, describing motion in words, is they're two sides of the same coin. And I rightly referred to Horace's Ut Pictura Poesis, which in turn is connected to Simonides' famous saying that she referred to about the two sides of the same coin. These are, shall we say, givens in all human narrative endeavors, and they are independent of whatever medium there is. So if this makes sense to you, or at least part of it makes sense to you, then, if I may say so, the immortal gods have not put me on this earth completely in vain, because I think that's really my quote-unquote mission in this in my academic endeavors, to make that case, particularly to skeptics who think, well, Greeks and Romans couldn't make movies, so what's the point? But they, I think, are missing the point, because Greeks and Romans, as Barzan said, could make movies, not technologically, certainly not, but in ancient art, it's already there. Yeah, look at the discoverers, or consider, for instance, let me just add this as a last example, Roman wall paintings, in which in the static painting, which still tells a story, the same character, such as Perseus or Aeneas, appears more than once, 2 or 3 times in the same image. Or consider the sequence in the Villa of the Mysteries of the initiation into Dionysiac ceremonies that are shown in the wall paintings, or mythological relief sculptures on Roman sarcophagi, such as the story of Medea and others. So that is basically my point in my justification, at least to myself, in trying this. Have I sort of answered your question, Eduardo?
Yes,
Yeah?
thanks
Thank
very
you.
much, Martin. Yes.
Thank you, Eduardo.
And
Thank you.
this show the power of the transformation of the myth in the cinema. This is very important for me in this case.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Can I just add one little thing to this? As you may have noticed in connection with the clip from Wrath of the Titans, it's a very loose adaptation of an ancient myth, and it has the wrong hero, Perseus, not Theseus, in the labyrinth, and so on. But that also is standard procedure in cinema. But it shows you the flexibility of myths. As you know, everybody knows this idea here, that in antiquity, there was no such thing as a right myth or a wrong version of a myth. You consider that Euripides, for instance, has Helen, Menelaus' wife, in Troy, in the Trojan Women, and not the real Helen is not in Troy, in Euripides' play Helen. So how can you do this? Both we can say this is right and this is wrong. So the flexibility of myth then carries over into this new medium in which stories can be told and retold and changed as they were already in antiquity, in visual narratives, with images, with music, with sound effect, with dialogue, as the ancients did on the page and on the stage. So it's just a continuation without the limitations that they had back then of the basic same principle. I'm beginning to sound very preachy, I'm afraid, so I better shut up. But thank you, Eduardo. This is a major point.
Thanks,
thanks
very much. Cecília, eu poderia continuar só para perguntar para a Ana rapidamente. É um prolongamento dessa questão. Ana, por favor, posso fazer em português mesmo?
Claro, claro.
Sim. Eu fiquei fascinado com esse recorte que você trouxe, né, do Márcias, né, e Cristo, essa questão de uma certa evolução da imagem, né? O que eu pensei assim mais em relação a essa transformação do mito e da imagem, na verdade, né, você traz logo assim no início da sua apresentação sobre o processo criativo ser algo aparentemente vindo do nada, né? E isso me parece ser assim, parece que há uma necessidade de um recorte temporal histórico que torna a imagem, né, e os mitos algo novo, assim, relativamente, não sei, que quebra um indivíduo que assiste, um indivíduo que cria, e que aparentemente é algo vindo do nada, né, esse ex nihilo, mas tem todo um processo histórico, um corte, se a gente pudesse usar assim, um conceito, né, que acho que você já está mais acostumado, esse corte no sujeito, né, assim. E eu queria que você falasse mais sobre isso, assim, sobre essa transformação da imagem a partir disso.
Super obrigada, Eduardo, e obrigado também por ter me ajudado tanto. Acho que a ideia, que é uma ideia muito cara à psicanálise, da criação ex nihilo, de alguma forma se junta, e a sua pergunta é muito pertinente, muito profunda, porque você traz toda uma questão, que é uma questão de uma seriedade absoluta para todos nós humanistas, que é a questão da história, do recorte, do mito, da leitura da história, né? Eu falei recorte, eu acho que eu vou voltar ao comentário da Beth, do l'instant prégnant, porque ao mesmo tempo em que há uma continuidade, você tem a quebra. E é justamente no recorte, na quebra, na passagem do tempo, aí eu discordo da leitura de Calvino, há uma descontinuidade na continuidade. Daí se instaura um conceito que para nós é muito pertinente, que é a ideia do vazio, né? Talvez se use na psicanálise de uma forma pouco rigorosa do ponto de vista filológico, ao qual o Martin estava aludindo, e, enfim, a formação toda de vocês é como classicistas. Para nós, a rigor, apesar de Lacan recorrer à expressão latina, o diálogo é com a tradição chinesa, com a ideia do vazio mediano, ou vazio médio, como é traduzido para o português, né? O vazio pleno e o vazio mediano, que implica sempre quando na continuidade se institui uma descontinuidade, e aí você tem um vazio. Não é um vazio absoluto, não é um nada, não é a negação. Aí, mais tarde, na teoria lacaniana, haverá uma diferenciação entre o nada e o vazio, né? Porque o nada já é alguma coisa. Por exemplo, um caso clássico, pacientes anoréxicos que dizem, eu comi nada. Nada já é um objeto. Não é o vazio, né? Então, é essa contradança que você pontuou de uma forma tão rica, e é, de fato, um problema que se coloca para todos nós que trabalhamos nas humanidades, especialmente nesse cruzamento que me atrai tanto entre a psicanálise e a literatura, ou algumas artes. Muito obrigada pela questão, muito rica.
Eu que agradeço, porque eu sempre fico incomodado com, né, aquela máxima que a gente tem, né, do ex nihilo nihil fit, e a gente fica,
Sim.
não, existe alguma coisa que dá continuidade a partir do nada, porque não é um nada, não é algo absoluto, né?
Não é absoluto, exatamente, não é absoluto, né? O que é no pensamento chinês o vazio mediano.
Queridos, eu sinto muito, mas vou ter que interromper, porque temos a performance agora do Rodrigo, e a gente pode fazer um intervalo de 7 minutos, o que não é nada, mas já é alguma coisa.